You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
Try to slice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood, art Ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and I am excited to say this marks 5 years of exploring visual arts in an audio medium, and I thought there is no better guest to bring on for this episode than one of my oldest friends, one of my best teaching friends, and probably most frequent guest on the podcast, Chuck Hoff. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me as a guest. I feel honored. I told you this a little bit, but we are running your show daily at our junior high, Kennedy Junior High is a little plug there. And my students, many of them were your former students, are huge fans of the show. And we've made it a cahoot. And for those out there, I would suggest you do so too, and use his fun facts, like the Friday fun facts, as a great way to engage your learners.
Thank you. And to any of my former students who are stuck having to listen to this, I am so sorry. But you know, I'm sure they thought they were finally getting away from me, and you just will not let that happen. So, on some level, I appreciate it. On some level, I feel so bad for those children. But today, we should have a good episode. We are talking about really hitting the highlights here. I put a lot of thought into like, what do I want to talk about in like a milestone episode like this? Because at this point, I've done a few hundred episodes of this podcast and, you know, Art Smart and, you know, my son's podcasts. So like I've done a lot, covered a lot, and I wanted to kind of mark this with Impressionism, in some ways bringing it back to where it all started. I mean, the pilot episode I did years ago, like after school in my classroom with Tony, my librarian, just experimenting to see how this would go. We were talking about Georges Seurat's Sunday Afternoon on La Grande Jatte. And, you know, for me, Impressionism and Post Impressionism, like that was my entry point into art. Impressionism, for whatever reason, has captivated me since I was second grade. It's one of the earliest memories I have. But I know it's oddly polarizing because a lot of people look at Impressionism and say that's where art went wrong. And that's where the de-skilling happened in art. What do you think of that movement?
So like you, I feel very similar. I think that is a bridge to many of our young artists. I feel like second and third grade, they get a taste of Starry Night, and they realize they're not a million miles from being able to create something that has movement. So it touches on some of our principles. And when they create that, they feel closer to an artist, obviously. They can kind of feel that out, and they feel like, you know what, it's possible that I could create something, you know, as beautiful as this piece and not feel so awestruck like I'm a million miles from a hyper-realist or some of the other, you know, paintings that you can introduce. And they would just feel overwhelmed. So I started that way too, I feel.
Yeah, and I think it's funny, even as we describe it, like as you say, you see it as a kid and you think like, I'm not that far away. I could do that, you know, like, which is kind of why so many people like it. It feels approachable, and it's also kind of why it's so derided and what made it so controversial in its day. Like to us today, we're so used to those like pleasant little daubs of color that it feels like the safest, most innocuous form of art because it's just pretty pictures of landscapes. But in its day, and when I say its day, I mean the first Impressionist exhibition was 1874. And, you know, so that's sort of the debut of, they weren't calling themselves the Impressionists at that time, but that first exhibition, a critic, Louis Leroy, ripped them apart, saying like, these aren't finished works, these are mere impressions, it's a rough sketch, it looks like wallpaper. And we still hear versions of that criticism today. As you look at it, like, why do you think the Impressionists hit with people so differently?
So it's a really good question. I think when I first stepped into education, I remember hearing stories of a lot of my students, athletes and such. And I was coaching too at the time. So I got all these levels and different perspectives and from different schools. And over the years, I've taught at 3 different school districts. So what I was getting their impression of what art was. And it needed to be, the sun needed to be drawn and painted a certain way. And, there needed to be a bit of realism in all their drawings. And they would get into arguments with their art teachers. And it was really, really frustrating. I had a girl one time, according to her parents, she was told to finish her incorrect drawing so that the teacher can use it in future years as an example. And I'm guessing, I'm kind of beating around the bush a little bit and getting to my point. My point is, this is just a really nice example, or like a resource that kids can have that says, you don't have to look at it the way everybody looks at it, through a photograph. You can actually have your own perspective on what stars look like, or what a Sunday afternoon looks like, when it kind of looks like, a little Mario Brothers kind of clouds and trees. And the kids can feel safe just creating. And I really like that, because they weren't looking at me for an answer, but rather just expressing themselves, based on a few examples that I would lead them with.
Yeah. And so as we look at, the development of that work, I think in there you're really getting at a lot of what was happening. So that first Impressionist exhibition, they called themselves, it was such a mouthful, they called themselves the Anonymous Society of Painters, Sculptors, Printmakers, etc. Terrible, terrible branding on that. But the show was good. And I think what's interesting is, as you look at it, they really were independent and just trying to show stuff that didn't fit with the salon's ideas of what painting should be. And for listeners who are newer to the show, welcome. I am glad you have found it. And we've got a whole bunch of stuff in the back catalog for you to explore. But I've talked a lot about this because I love the Impressionists. They were trying to do something that was a little bit different. And all of those people in the now we call Impressionist movement, they were kind of coming at it from different backgrounds, different approaches. But what they all had in common was they were trying to get away from that rigid hierarchy of, historical paintings and allegorical works and religious and mythological subjects as being the end all be all. And they were saying, listen, the landscapes we see around us, the people walking the streets, the workers, Paris is being rebuilt. It's becoming this modern cosmopolitan center. That stuff matters. And that's what they wanted to capture. The fleeting moments in this rapidly changing world, because it really was rapidly changing. I mean, when we think historically, this was maybe just a few years after the end of the Franco-Prussian War, the advent of photography. You talked about photorealism and stuff, like photography and Louis Daguerre and all that. That was the middle of the 19th century that came about, and photography became widespread and accessible to the masses. And even something like the tube of paint The tube of paint was a 19th century invention. And so like I feel like all these forces start to come together and people were ready for something different. And that's where we had the Impressionists like Claude Monet going outside the studio and making these quick paintings of just what they saw out in the world. And mostly it was nature. You know, Claude Monet always famously did the haystacks. You know why he did those haystacks?
No, I do not.
So I read this apparently, like, you know, the end of the season, the farmers gather the hay, right? So it's like end of summer as they're gathering that. And then they would leave it in stacks out in the field to dry out for a period. And so then you're getting into the fall, and very often it couldn't be all collected in the fall, and so it would sit out all winter, and it wouldn't be like till mid to late spring that would all be finally like taken in and harvested fully. And so when he was looking for a subject that would be stationary and he could see and study in different times of day, different lighting environments, different seasons of the year, well, the haystack is it, right? Because it would sit out in the field for like 9 months. Which I always found interesting. I always looked at it and I'm like, why haystacks? Could you find a more boring topic? But like, I guess on a practical level, it works.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the lighting would change, right? Because you'd have winter haystack, spring haystack, and the directional light and the shadows. So I kind of get it.
Yeah. And that's really what I feel like the Impressionist movement became about in the end. It became about the artist's impression of what they're seeing right in front of them, trying to capture the light and shadow. And they were really influenced by, again, something that was relatively new on the scene. There was a book that came out like 1839. It was by... longtime listeners know I'm not going to get this pronunciation right. Michel Eugene Chevreul. The English translation of the title of the book would be like The Law of Simultaneous Color Contrast. So it was this book about essentially optical color theory, how our perception of one color is affected by what's around it. And to me, that's what the Impressionist movement was all about. It's just like, what are we seeing and perceiving just visually on the surface? We don't even need to know what it is. It's not about the object. It's not about anything more meaningful or symbolic, or there's nothing to unpack here. It's just about the surface quality. Where do you see the difference with like the post-impressionists? Because then we shifted from like Monet trying to capture what these different subjects looked like in the field at different times of year to people like Van Gogh and Seurat, who were, you know, like I said, the post-impressionists. How would you describe the difference in the post-impressionist lens?
So yeah, post-impressionism. As I look at the three works of art that you have as an example, we see an intensity, we see boldness, we see colors that are a little more distinct, you know, and they contrast each other. So you see some fine lines and a lot of experimentation. So when I look at the three works of art, for instance, and I think of the general movement, I think of experimentation as being one that I think I would love, you know, and I think it became one of the signature interests in what I found interesting at teaching and looking at and the variety. You know, I noticed a great variety. So, you know, for instance, Georges Seurat's piece is, you know, took 4 years to make, and it's humongous. And then when I looked at like Starry Night, it sits, you know, quite smaller than I thought it was going to be. So there's a great variety in the post-impressionism.
Yeah, and you know, like Starry Night for me is always just the standout, and exemplifies the movement in so many ways because it's just so expressive. I mean, the movement across the sky. And for me, that's the one I point to as the shift, because I see students who are always like, well, it's still just a bunch of dabs of color and everything. But it's like Monet and others in the Impressionist movement were just trying to capture what does it look like. And the post-impressionists, it became more about what does it feel like? What's this idea behind it? They're getting more symbolic. It's yes-anding the impressionists. You know what I'm saying? It's like it's taking their ideas just to that next level. And so I think now we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll start talking about a few of the favorite works that I have looked at and discussed over the last 5 years. So now I am back here talking Impressionism and Post-Impressionism with my good friend Chuck Hoff. We're going to try to cover 5 artists, 5 artworks for the 5th year anniversary. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, I would not mind 5 stars. But Chuck, as you're looking at this, let's start with Monet's Impression Sunrise. I mean, this is literally the piece that got the Impressionist movement started. The movement was named after this piece, and Louis Leroy saying, this isn't a real painting, it's just an impression. What do you think of it?
So to me, it's the good old-fashioned, squint your eyes and you might find something in it. Or move several steps backwards and you might see, the harbor or industrial revolution beginning or whatever, because you have a lot of things going on in what would be considered the background. You have a really muted gray blue. But what struck me as being pretty unusual is that red sun that is trying to get its way through. And then I like the way he splashed it in the waves, because there is a disturbance in the water. It would have been easy for everything to lay pretty flat because it is a morning sunrise. But he went and had disturbed it with the boats that were already in the water. And I think that's where my attention is. So he definitely has a focal point. He definitely sits the sun as close to the viewer as possible, and then everything else is consistent. So that to me is, I thought, unusual, and probably would have given it a lot of criticism at its time.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting to me is that sun is so bold, but part of the boldness is because everything else around it is so muted. Like you say, there are those people in the boat that's kind of in the foreground, the silhouette. That seems a little bolder. That has a good contrast because of the darkness with what's around it. But everything else is just, it's so hazy. You almost can't see the horizon from a distance, And there's just like this vague illusion at maybe smokestacks and stuff like that. And I kind of, on some level, I kind of like that. I kind of like that he's showing us like maybe the air is kind of thick. Maybe, the Industrial Revolution's happening and maybe it's getting a little hazy. Maybe it was just that time of day and that fog or whatever was going on just because of the natural weather patterns. But I like that he just showed it as he saw it from his view out his window and didn't get overly concerned about like, well, I got to make it pretty. Because this one, if I'm being honest, at least to my eye, it's not pretty.
Particularly the sky. Like when I look at the sky, it kind of falls apart a little bit. It gets disorganized and it's really rapid. And you can see where someone would say like, we are not even close to being finished here. But I also think, from a teacher standpoint and from many of the novices out there, painting landscapes, this is a great scaffold. Like, this is a great way to step them into what a muted landscape could look like, as there is some atmospheric haze, and frankly, some pollution. And that's what that would look like. So,
Yeah.
great step into building your landscapes up. And so that's why this piece, I feel, still appeals to me, even though, like I said before, mentioned, like that the sky is just so fast and so quick.
Yeah, honestly, like, I think if I saw someone in my classroom working on this, I would tell them we need to increase the contrast. We need a wider range of values here, because I'm losing stuff, and its reading is just too muddied, too much in that midtone. And then at the same time, it does feel like, I don't know, it feels almost like a JMW Turner kind of piece in some ways, where, you know, you are getting these brushstrokes that are a little bit wild, and you lose sight of the horizon. And, you know, there's a reason for that. I don't think it happened by accident. It's just, I don't know, not my cup of tea. But moving on, next one, because I don't want this to be too long and bore too many of our listeners. We've got Berthe Morisot. Now, she was actually probably the most successful of the Impressionists. She was one who had exhibited at the Paris Salon, but she joined with the Impressionists from that first showing in 1874 and just kept going with them. I think she just knew, like, this is the way of the future. And with this one, I picked out the Cradle, which I actually did a full episode on a while back. Listeners, check the links in the show notes. I've got a bunch that, you know, is referenced here, and more Impressionists and related stuff if you want to learn more. But as we're looking at the Cradle, what are you noticing here? What's jumping out at you?
So when I look at the Cradle, there is that semi-transparent material between the baby and the viewer, and so you do get a glimpse into what the mother's looking at. Obviously, baby's heading our way, mother's heading towards the baby, so we have like a triangle, and her arm kind of creates that triangle, so it keeps you inside the view. So I find that pretty interesting. I also notice some primary colors purposely, you know, in the painting. You know, you see these streaks of red and blue throughout, and then of course all the fleshy tones. So the palette is pretty simple, and probably pretty intentional.
Yeah, that subtle triangle, you're right. That's kind of interesting, because we see actually a couple of triangulated stuff happening with, like, the shape of that gauzy sort of material over the crib or cradle. That piece that's draped over is roughly triangular, and there's this implied triangle, like you said, between the mother looking down at the baby. Their two heads make two corners of a triangle, and then our eye is led across the edge of the baby's bed or whatever towards her hand, and her arm leads us right back up to her head. So there's interesting movement in the composition. It feels like there's so much that is soft and subtle, and yet very deliberately constructed. You know, like, you can tell she was very thoughtful about every element of this.
The probably discussion she had with her sister, you know, I'm sure this was not, you know, something she did as like an echo chamber, you know, just talk to some of her closest friends and family. And it's the baby. The baby's propped in kind of an unusual position.
Mm-hmm.
And I just feel that the shoulder is sunk quite a bit into that cradle to allow, you know, what is it, most of its position to be towards the viewer. So I'm not sure it's completely natural, but it is something that's kind of staged, and I think both needed an equal part in this painting.
Well, I think what's interesting is like on some ways it feels very natural and relatable, but you're right. There is something about the pose that like, yeah, my babies weren't necessarily side sleepers, you know, like I've never really seen that so much, but like, I mean, you get why it works for a composition. Like you got to see that baby's face. A picture with a baby, I want to see its face. But I think when you talk about her sister, you're right. This was a painting of her sister, Edma, who was also a painter, but more or less walked away from her career after she had the baby. And I feel like there's this interesting sort of sense of like, you know, what a woman sacrifices, gives up, the mixed feelings, like the joy of having a baby, but the change that comes to your life along with that, all kind of happening in this expression that I see there.
Absolutely, yes.
So moving on now, we've got Gustave Caillebotte's Paris Street Rainy Day from 1877. And you and I actually did a full episode on this one. So I'm sure you've memorized everything that you said 2 years ago. Take it away.
Okay, so here we go. we talked a little bit about the cast shadows being a bit muted. So they're floating on the streets. We talked about in the foreground, the viewer, you know, as they look off to the side, they look to the corner of the painting. That kind of keeps us in one half of the painting. We also see that the lamppost does divide the picture in two, where we have predominant foreground people on one side, and then on the other side we take a trip all the way down to what would be considered probably a quarter mile, maybe a half mile into the picture. But it is quite blocked on the other side of that lamppost with large umbrellas. So those were a couple things that we had noticed the first time that struck us as being a little unusual.
Yeah. And so, I mean, one of the things that stands out to me about this piece, obviously, it's like the perfect example of 2-point perspective. But one of the things that we didn't talk about that I have lately been like a little obsessed with is if you look at it, you can't really see or make out much of anybody's face except for that couple that's in the foreground, right? And so I started to dig into like, who was that couple? Who were these people? And from my research, I could not find a definitive explanation, but there are some people who theorize that the dude was Caillebotte's brother. Which I find kind of interesting. And I started looking at photographs side by side, and the photographs I've usually seen of, was it Marshall Caillebotte? I've usually seen him like with a full beard, but it does kind of look like him. Other people say it's just representing, you know, the well-dressed bourgeoisie of up-and-coming Paris and everything like that. But I just found that to be an interesting little thing because I'm digging for fun facts that we haven't covered already in this. And I like to think that he was putting his brother in there. The way that, like, remember when we did the Renoir, the luncheon on the boating party, and actually, like, Caillebotte's in there, his wife is in there, Renoir's wife, or future wife, was in there. You know, I think it's kind of cool that, like, all these people seem to know each other, hang out with each other, supported each other, and also, like, painted each other into their works. So, yeah, that was the one thing that stuck out to me.
So there are close to 30 people in this painting. And it's like the good old fashioned, like, I'm really bad at feet. All right, we'll take them all out of your painting. and not that he was bad at drawing faces, but you have to look at it like you've included 2 out of 30 people, and then you've just casted all of the umbrellas like over everyone's faces. You know, I could see that. in today's classroom, they would get teased a little bit, if their vulnerability was out there. The three other people that he did paint had 5 o'clock shadows, and they were completely in profile. So that I found pretty interesting too. I think it's pretty exhausting. I think he probably got to a point where he's like, this is so technical, and maybe he didn't mean to go down this, and then he had to put a bunch of people in, and he's like, I'm done, or I'm certainly not as good at people as I am with buildings.
I am dying now because I'm looking through the rest of Caillebotte's work, and there are so many paintings where you see the backs of people's heads, the floor scrapers, like they're looking down at the floor. You see the top of their head. You see the oarsman rowing. Again, there's a hat covering their face. The young man at his window, you see him from behind. Like, there's so many of these paintings. It's like, the engineer loved to do these technical things, the cityscapes, the perspective stuff. Maybe it was just the ultimate dodge. Like, and he did paint faces. It's not like in his entire body of work there are no faces, and the ones he painted, they were fine, better than I would do. But I looking at this, I do wonder, like, was he just not that into faces? Because there are some things that, like, even though you can draw them or paint them, it's just not that fun. Wild speculation. This is not based on any like serious research, but I like that theory, and I'm going with that for the rest of my life.
Well, I appreciate that.
If I'm wrong, don't tell me.
And it's not. I don't think it's very controversial. I'm just bringing it back to our young artists that we're teaching, and how they get pretty good at doing something, and something that they're not fond of. I wouldn't even say good, bad, but just, I'm tired of this. And it just seems like if you put 30 characters in, good for you. Because this certainly doesn't need to be an empty street in Paris. And it's particularly on a rainy day. But at some point he was like, I'm done. Or I'm checking out.
Got to be the first person to describe that painting as like someone giving up, like, I'm done. I've done enough. Like the man who is painting the reflections in the water accumulating between the cobblestones. Like, yeah, he got lazy. I guess shifting gears a little bit towards another one that we actually talked about on a previous episode, Van Gogh's Starry Night. This is from 1889, which brings us into that post-impressionist era. I mean, it's not strictly a date, but stylistically, this would be something I always point at as post-impressionistic, as I've already alluded to, because of the movement and the emotion. When you look at this, what jumps out at you?
So, I mean, for me, the lines are both, horizontal and vertical, and they seem to work, even though, it's super simplistic and yet very recognizable. So everybody, first off, young viewers would probably say, what is this burning bush, or what is happening in the foreground?
With the cypress?
Yeah, with the cypress tree. And then the second thing I think is quite striking, in small towns and great big cities, the steeple is usually present, and the tallest structure in some of our smaller towns. In our large town of Naperville, I know St. Peter and Paul's Chapel is huge, and can be seen for, 10 miles around if you get up on a tall hill. And I find that pretty striking because it's dead center in his painting, and it's very similar to the cypress tree, and it's and how it just stretches into the sky. And I know I brought those two things up because usually people probably start at the sky, but I think the church was pretty significant of small towns and how much taller it was than everything else, and how it stood out.
Yeah, but I think what's really interesting about this, because we know that he wasn't doing a straight up view of what he saw out his window. Like the cypress tree, he pulled that extremely forward into the foreground. Because from his window, it was very distant. It would have looked much smaller on the horizon. And I think the town wasn't even visible from that window. But he did this sort of this mashup of different views he had seen of his surroundings and put a twist on it. And the thing I always find interesting, because like you say, that steeple is so tall. You can see it is so much taller than the other buildings. But even the highest point on that steeple doesn't make it more than a third of the way up the canvas. You know, like it barely breaks past the horizon line. And I think that's the thing that I always emphasize to students is this choice of scale and the way that he made the sky occupy 2/3 of this composition. Like that sky is so vast. It makes everything else seem so much smaller in comparison. And I think it just makes it feel big and open and expansive, largely because of that just low sloped horizon.
Also, to your point, he had it seemed very deliberate, kind of like his thoughts were about how he was going to make wind, like how is he going to make this whole thing work, or it swirled around and tucked into a hill and reflected some of the stars, and he needed space. Like this wasn't going to be something he squished up at the top. It wouldn't have been as effective if he did it any other way. But in comparing it to some other examples, this was vastly different because it was, it de-emphasized some of the things that you have right at the bottom. That really small, cozy town, is drawn in all these different perspectives. To your point, he grabbed buildings from the different views and perspectives that he had, and through his window, even though it wasn't all drawn to the same perspective, you get the idea.
Yeah.
But it is a Mod Podge, and it is something he puts together quite quickly. But that sky is stunning.
Yeah, I mean it has that feel of quick brushstrokes, but like I say, with the post impressionists, it's not that just what I saw in that moment. As we've both said, like it's this composite. He's putting together these different views to capture an idea more broadly. And to move on now, I think we're going to end this one kind of as I began the show, talking about Georges Seurat's Sunday Afternoon on La Grande Jatte. This one was from 1884, so I guess we're going out of order on this, but I think it still works. When we look at this, it's, the pointillist masterpiece, although he wouldn't have called it pointillism, he liked divisionism. All these tiny little dots. It's funny because it's like people who are relaxed in the park, but it also feels so stiff. I mean, you said before the dude spent years on this and made like 60 studies of it. What do you think of this piece?
Well, it's got so to me, my first impression, I've of course stood in front of it, and so I got to see it live, and I've seen it several times, and I love to stare at what they all could be staring at. And so my first impression is this: I have sometimes a hard time seeing the trees that are up near the top of the painting. They're completely in fuzz, right? So you can't tell if they're all the way in the back, as they should be, right? Because you don't, they're not contoured out, or are they in the front? Because everything else is stylized and super, crisp, and it has the cast shadows and hard lines for shoulders and elbows. but not the trees. Like the trees could almost be a faint cloud. So that would be my first question for Georges Seurat. Like, what were you thinking here? Right? Because it has me all confused. So that it was like an MC Escher, a little bit of like a trick or a trick of eye or something, because I see a bunch of trees that are coming towards me, and yet everything else is like super fuzzy. So it's a little trippy, but that was my first impression.
Well, it's like the trunk of the tree is pretty defined. It's just the canopy of leaves dissolves and gets fuzzy, right?
That's exactly right.
That's what you're seeing? Yeah.
Yep. I mean, the quick point, of course, is she's she's got a pet monkey. I mean, and everybody like laughs, and everything goes to this corner of the painting, and then you got to figure out, is this normal, or is this like super affluent? Yes, this lady would always have her pet monkey, right? Because she's dressed really well. But I'm guessing my first eyes were the composition and what works and what doesn't, and what was done maybe on purpose or what was de-emphasized. And so that's why up in the top of the picture, I always had a problem with a few of those tree canopies, or just one canopy, but a bunch of trees that kind of blended together.
Yeah, I mean, it is the one tree by the water that I can't unsee it now. So thank you for that.
Sorry.
It's funny the thing that bothered me actually was not even so much that it's the, I guess, relative flatness of the faces. Again, it's these hazy faces that are like all in this midtone. There's not like there aren't a lot of like hard shadows. There's not a lot of range in the value within the faces on these figures. You know what I'm saying? Like
100%.
They're all in this flat tone, which like fine, that's a style, but with everything like there are really hard shadows cast on the ground and stuff like that. So it's like there's this mismatch, I guess. And you're giving a version of that as well. But I think the one thing we can all agree on is a pet monkey is awesome. Always will be. And I'm still jealous because I remember writing to my local government petitioning to find out if I could get a pet monkey as a small child. I never got my monkey.
Yeah, and because of that, we're on the backside of the pandemic. We have, at home we have, 2 geckos and 5 turtles and 130 fish and an extra dog because of it. So I can look at that monkey and say, like, good for you, but man, I hope my kids don't get any ideas. And to your point, about the faces, I mean, great notice, because I notice where the umbrellas are positioned, and so some of it is believable. Like some of it is just your constant cast shadow, but there's no back reflective light, so there's no bouncing the light back up into the face, and so it just stays muted. And I looked around the painting, I'm like, all right, well, there's got to be a break in this. And the 2 girls, the back of their head, at least the one, should probably be in sunlight because she's right at the edge of that shadow, and he won't allow it. It's almost like you're safe in this zone, but you're not safe in that zone. And so he zones it all out as, let's just believe for a minute that everything has a shadow.
Well, I think the thing that bothers me about it is, you're playing around so much with like, how do I create an effect? And, the dots of colors, it's not realism. So like, we don't need to have realistic shadows and everything like that. Like, you're going to say that under the parasol, everything's going to get into this hazy midtone and stuff, because you're not getting the dramatic, like, chiaroscuro lighting effects and stuff like that. I get that, but this isn't real. This isn't meant to be real. This is his painting of a scene. And if you're doing your rendition of a scene, I feel like you should make choices that are just like helpful to the composition. And that's the thing that's always bothered me about the stylization of some of these figures, is there's just this flatness to it and a stiffness to it that, I don't know, it doesn't work for me so much. There's a lot that's good about it, don't get me wrong. I've returned to this painting multiple times, and I'm bringing it up in my anniversary episode when I'm talking about like 5 of my favorite Impressionist and Post Impressionist works. But every time I see that, it's just like, it bothers me, and I'm not sure why. Like I should be able to let it go, and yet I can't.
I think because it's consistent, it's huge, and it took forever. So some of those are maybe we excuse it a little bit and we allow it in because of some of the variables that we just consider to be like, I'm pretty awestruck, but it's like I said, when you walk up on it, it stops you for a minute. But man, that's a lot to consider as the counter is pretty there too. Like we have these faces and everything feels like Walking Dead. And you're like, are they alive? Are they dead? What's going on? And, or is it just, everything just stopped in the world, like a movie, because they are very stiff, like you said, except for the animals. I'll give them that. The animals are moving. At least one is.
Well, the animals are moving, and there's a little girl who looks like she's dancing and stuff in the middle ground.
Sure.
But when we talk about the animals, I mean, there's a pet monkey in there, and that should pop. There should be higher contrast so that monkey stands out more. Like, if all of this is so contrived, like, really heighten the contrast and pull my focus to different areas. And I guess if we're getting at like the focus and stuff, everybody's basically looking off to the left. We're looking out at the water that's really not even in frame. So it's like everybody's looking out of frame, which kind of breaks one of the old compositional rules. And I know artists are always trying new things and breaking the rules, and that's how you do something different that gets people's attention. But I don't know. That's a rule I like.
It's a
Look
long
into
time.
frame.
I was going to say it's a long time to spend on a painting to break a bunch of rules and then hope it works. But
I mean, it did work. We're talking about it.
It did work,
150 years later.
And a museum probably spent a lot of money buying it. So good for you.
And every other museum would spend an even more obscene amount of money if they could buy it today. But yeah, I think it works in a lot of ways for at least the color theory, the dots and everything. Like, your eye does blend them nicely, and I like the frame, the border around it, and the way that he shifted those different colors and the juxtaposition of complementary colors in some areas. Like, it was good proof of concept, I'll give him that. And hats off to him for the dedication on this.
He knew how to, put a little yellow in with the green, but also lighten up the green and darken up the green and stay with lots of the browns and, pink. It can't be, he's got red and pink together on some of the outfits. I like what he did there for sure. Where you could tell he kept it simple enough because it was a pretty busy composition. So sometimes kudos to you because, or kudos to the artist because there's so much going on that you need to sacrifice a few things. And maybe it was the color palette because he kept it, pretty simple.
Well, simple in some ways and needlessly complicated in others. He spent 2 years working on this, 60 studies for it, and the color palette and the shadows and the hard shadows, I think that's largely because of, like I said, he was influenced by the theory about the juxtaposition or side-by-side placement of complementary or opposite colors, and the way that you could define shadows not just with black but with color, and the little dots that you're putting next to each other and all of that. And I think this was a strong work in that regard. And he spent 2 years on it. I've spent 5 years on this garbage, and I think we can all agree he had a little bit more to show for his time than I did.
Do we know if this was made a TV set? Is this a 1980s TV set with all the little pixelations?
The dots, like it does. Yeah. It does have that feel of like the fuzz that you would get on the old rabbit ear TV.
I couldn't even imagine what George was feeling, because he's sitting there for 2 years, and people would walk by and go, "Are you ever going to do these? Are you going to finish this? Are you going to?" And he's like, "Just give it a minute."
Well, I think you're right, I think that's a good sort of note to end on here, is that like these people, it had to take a lot of courage. Creativity takes courage. Putting something out there takes courage, and there are always going to be people who can detract, and there can be people like me who are going to sit there and pick it apart and be like, I think you could have had a brighter highlight here and a darker shadow here to get a wider range and, make this part pop and stuff like that. But, I think the fact that people would take this time and put really their livelihood on the line. I mean, this was their career. This was a big deal for them to put something out there. If people didn't like it, for a good number of them, except for like Caillebotte, if people didn't like it, if people didn't buy it, they didn't eat. They didn't have a place to stay, They needed this to work out, and it was a big risk. Morisot leaving the salon and going to the Independence show, like, that was not, by most people's estimation, a safe or smart path. I mean, she was successful, but it very easily could have gone another way.
And we have to always just put this in. They were given the tools to see things in a way that would be competitive with the previous movement. And yet they decided, I'm going to create my own style. And that's what makes it super tricky, is that when you're going in that direction, I mean, there's 20-80% chance that this will work out. And some of it may not sell while they're living, but it takes off and people start mimicking it. And then it becomes this movement. So, so intentional for sure in the direction, but I always am reminded, like Jackson Pollock's and stuff, like it doesn't start that way. It just becomes a different movement because they needed something that was less restrictive.
Yeah, they all kind of learned the rules before they broke the rules, and I said before, creativity takes courage, but I think the other thing that I would always want people to remember is, it's really important to be supportive of friends who are trying something new and putting something out there into the world. And the Impressionists, part of the reason that they made it was because people like Caillebotte were using their resources to support their friends. Like Caillebotte, his family made a huge fortune off the textile industry and the building of Paris and real estate and everything like that. So like he never had to work. He could make what he wanted and didn't have to worry about selling anything. But all the rest of his friends, did have to work and did have to sell stuff, and he put together shows, he bought their work, and he, donated stuff to the Musée d'Orsay, and that network of support is really what made the difference, because during the year of the first Impressionist exhibition, if I recall the numbers correctly, it was something like 400,000 people went through the Paris Salon, and something like 4,000 people went through the Impressionist exhibition. I mean, it was like 100 times more people going to the Salon. So it was a real act of courage to be putting their stuff out in at that time, the Anonymous Society of Independent Artists, Sculptors, and Printmakers, etc. show.
Yeah, well said.
And on that note, I'm going to end this longer than average episode, but we did it. We got 5 artists for our 5-year anniversary. Thank you so much once again, Chuck Hoff. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Absolutely. I was honored.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.